Thank you very much for being here today with us. My name is François Israel Savary. I am the political advisor of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, the European think tank, and in partnership with TASC. Today we're gathering for this Towards Recovery conference. Towards recovery, I'd like to start by making some comments to kick the debate. Towards austerity would be the line at the moment, I'm afraid. One of my colleagues was at a meeting with the European Commission yesterday and gathering a number of high officials, and something was said here which was, we need to go out there and explain why these austerity measures are good for everyone. It should be clear, however, that reducing fiscal deficits and cutting public spending is an ideological choice. Recovery demands the institutional reforms tackling the sources of economic crisis with the problems for recovery and long-term economic stability. We have been reforming, or at least debating reforms, for a while now, and the result is quite meagre in this respect. Rules and automatic sanctions versus choices. The fiscal rules and sanction focus on public debt, yes, but what about private debt management? Debt versus expenditure. Focus at the moment is on debt reduction, but not on public investment for future growth. And financial regulation and taxation. Basel III rules could be called insufficient. There's no financial transaction tax at the moment. And recovery that goes at high social costs and the breaking down of the welfare states ought not to be called recovery, as this means recovery for some groups of the society, but not for other groups of society. And we cannot all try to recover through selling our products abroad. Global demand is lower because of the recession, first. Second, it could lead also to the lowering of wage costs for more competitiveness, thereby increasing income inequality and curbing internal demand. And we do not want a situation where everyone tries to gain on the global markets at the expense of others through exchange rates, policies, and protectionism. So, towards recovery, it's still a long way to go. And that's why we're here today. So, once again, welcome to everyone. I hope that we have some fruitful debates that will be provocative, for I think that we need to go deep down in the intellectual reflection in order to sustain economy and to have a sustainable economy. Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to the panel now.
Thank you very much to TASC and FEPS for this invitation, and above all for organizing such an important event and such a timely event. I think we have a very good panel, so I will only briefly introduce the subject and introduce them, but I thought it might be useful just to reflect on two key issues. The first one is, why did this happen, this terrible crisis, and what can we do so it never happens again? And I think, as you know better perhaps than anybody else, one of the key failings was lack of regulation and great liberalization of the financial sector, because we know that the financial sector is so riddled with imperfections. And we need to advance in the process of re-regulating the financial sector to avoid these crises, but also to transform the financial sector to serve the needs of the real economy. I think that one of the things that has not been actually done is to regulate rating agencies. And one of the problems that countries like Ireland, Spain, others are facing is that they're being regulated by their fates are being decided by rating agencies who are highly procyclical, who have very bad methodologies and so on. And domestically, if I may say something about the Irish situation, about which I've come more to learn than to say anything, is that You have Irish pension funds who could much more invest, for example, in your own government debt, so that you rely less on these more fickle foreign investors. And that could also, as this institute and as the Labour Party here has said, invest much more in infrastructure, in financing new SMEs, and so on. So I think the whole role of how we can regulate and transform the financial sector to serve the needs of the real economy and to avoid it undermining the real economy is a really important challenge, perhaps more for the future, but even for helping get out of the crisis. But the second issue, which I think is more the focus of this particular panel, it relates to how countries can maintain growth while doing any necessary fiscal adjustment at an appropriate pace and of an appropriate scale. But the key, as Francois already stressed, is how can Ireland maintain growth. And this is not actually just the perception of progressives, I think. I phoned up one of my former students who now is very senior in the City of London, and he said to me, talking to people in the capital markets, for us the main challenge for Ireland is whether it can deliver growth in the next few years. We know they can do fiscal consolidation. They're pretty good at that. Maybe too good, he said. But we want to know whether they can deliver growth. And this is a little bit the trap, because I think if you just cut back government spending in a context when private spending is shrinking, because the private sector is deleveraging, as it has too much debt, which is particularly true in this country, then you have the problem that you will have less growth, and if you have, or even a decline of GDP. And if you do that, even though your debt may be falling, the ratio, this is pure arithmetic, the ratio of debt to GDP may not fall as quickly as you wish. So you can, and then the markets will punish you for lack of growth. So it's a very difficult dilemma for policymakers, but I think growth is the path that can deliver both debt sustainability and employment and future development. So now I'll give the floor to the people who know much more about this, and we will start with Gary Sweeney. Oh, sorry, with Paul Sweeney, who is of course well known to all of you. He's economic advisor to the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. He's a graduate of Trinity College Dublin, but he also has a lot of practical experience. He's worked as a tax inspector, a scary person to know, and an economic consultant. And he has a lot of inside experience on the Irish economy as president of the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland, and a member of the National Competitiveness Council of Ireland board. So we really look forward to your valuable economic and political insights.
I actually believe that for once, if I say that Ireland is at a crossroads, I've never felt that anything is so important as the steps we take right now, both in the government plan, the 4-year plan, unfortunately a 4-year plan that they're launching in mid-November, and in the budget, and in dealing with the bankers. It's just an incredibly important time. Okay, I'm going to say 3 things. Ireland has a good but not sound modern real economy. The real economy, we should remind ourselves, in Ireland it's pretty good. It's not sound because of the overheads, the financial sector, the bonds, the banks, the fiscal debt, and the huge unemployment. But if we manage to solve those not very insignificant problems, we should motor along nicely. I'm going to show that the government blew the boom big time in an amazingly bad way. And today they're compounding, in my view. This is what we're here for, to have a debate. And we all have different views on different points of view, as you'll see. I think they're pursuing very deflationary policies. And I think they've been duped by the bankers and by their advocates. And their advocates, the whole thing is getting very unbalanced. Morning Ireland, a programme that used to be a good programme to listen to. If you heard the interview, the fawning interview with the banker this morning on Ireland, on public radio, which was an absolute disgrace, followed immediately by an excuse for the bank, the tax fiddling by multinationals, uncritical. So, I mean, the forces, the whole thing, TASC is very necessary at this time because the powerful interests of the banks and all of their spokespersons, some of whom are genuinely well-intentioned, but some others are actually motivated. The Celtic Tiger was always a catch-up phase, and there was a real substantial boom where everything, all the boxes were ticked for 15 years. Average incomes of take-home pay of the average worker nearly doubled in that period. And other things happened, I'll show you in a minute. Growth lifted Ireland onto a modern plane. Our living standards rose slightly above Europe, and even with the fall, which I'll talk about, we're still up there. But from the late 1990s, the seeds of destruction were sown, and frankly, it was a certain type of economics that was dominant then. And they were, in my view, I don't want to be too alarmist, but poisonous. A type of deregulation that was really, really bad, and you all know about that now. Privatisation and pro-cyclical tax cutting with enormous tax breaks. But I was delighted to read in the paper today that a Fianna Fáil junior minister tells us that tax breaks didn't do any harm to Ireland. There's the stunning growth. The numbers of people at work in Ireland since the foundation of the state was always around 1.1 million. And even today it's at 1.850 million, which is a lot better than it used to be. So we should remember that. That's a certain level of economic demand that's there to be harnessed or de-harnessed. Interest rates, what went wrong? Interest rates set by the ECB were too low, about 4% for most years. I think there's consensus on that. The banks behaved badly, and they lent furiously. We know of AIB setting up a particular unit to catch up with Anglo, and they were just like drunken soldiers firing money at the dogs in the street to buy apartments or kennels or whatever. The government pursued strongly pro-cyclical policies. They cut taxes during the boom. I personally can say that I and Congress of Trade Unions opposed the taxes, so much so that we even appealed to Europe on one of them to try and get a debate on tax cutting. We were ridiculed, even by economists who should have known about pro- and counter-cyclical policies. They gave huge tax subsidies to the property investors, and there was a whole culture of deregulation. And the financial regulator, in one way, if I'm to mitigate him, I could say that, I'm on the National Competitiveness Council, we're about to publish a report. One of the first things we're going to say is we must have a good financial regulatory system. In 2006, I had to write a minority report with Peter McClune because they called for further deregulation of the financial system. Representatives of the Department of Finance, Enterprise and Employment, Taoiseach's office, industry and so on, all signed up. That was the mantra. Deregulation, especially in financial services, we get all kinds of people in there. And that was the attitude. So to oppose it, you were certainly a freak, and I'm proud that I was a freak. The government boosted the property boom bust, and they were really into it. They blew the gains of the boom. Now, the labour market, seeing that I'm a trade unionist, the biggest fall in employment and GNP in the OECD, the labour force participation has fallen rapidly. It'll be in the next slide. Had it remained at 2007 levels today, the rate of unemployment would be 21%. The CSO show unemployment at 17.9% on a measure of those who want to work and can't get a job. Youth unemployment has soared. Long-term unemployment, which is really difficult to get rid of, is doubled. Immigration soaring, though the ESRI said they got it wrong for the year to October. They got it wrong by twice as much, but they're upping the stakes for next year by 10,000 more to go than their previous estimate. Hourly earnings in the private sector rose slightly in the last 2 years, but the figures out yesterday show last year they fell on an hourly basis, which is what matters to trade unionists, weekly down because people aren't working as much. In the public sector, substantial cut, as any public servant here knows. So earnings are going to be down by about 2% this year and next. That's the labour force participation rate. If you're not familiar with it, it probably doesn't look like much, from 64 to 61%, but it actually means quite a lot. We're the worst performer in the Western world, there's no doubt. Iceland is nothing on us, and maybe even Greece. We can't blame Lehman Brothers, Bertie Ahern, I'm afraid. Our GNP has fallen by a fifth in just a few years, and we've lost 7 years, and I don't know how long it will be before it catches up again. And we're pretty uncertain. The bank subsidies and the way the government is handling the bankers is just caved in at every step. The Irish government policies have caused the boom, as I said, and the bust of today. The bust could have been avoided. I think we would have had a recession for a while, but not the kind we have. We actually generated, on the current account, 58 billion in surpluses. We paid for all our investment out of that money. And now our deficit, 20%, it's 32%. It keeps going up. And I read this, I updated and changed. But anyway, we've given unparalleled subsidies to the banks while cutting welfare, everything, and we haven't heard half of it yet. When will we regain the 2000s figure, national income? 2018, if we got what the ESRI had predicted, but GNP is still falling. Above the zero line was the 58 billion in surpluses, and Charlie McCreevy was cutting every time he saw the surpluses, and you remember the Department of Finance officials looking startled every year, oh God, where's all this money coming from, and we're still cutting taxes. The world is a very different place now. The governance system has failed. Markets were so free that whole stakeholder value model that Jack Welch's founder calls bunkum was the thing. They fiddled the accounts, the CEOs and CFOs and all the rest of them, COOs of big companies. They set the rules and they abused them, and the banks collapsed. Shareholder value, that whole thing, we're not even talking about that in Ireland on company law. It's a crazy system. The regulators failed, the government failed, you've heard this. There wasn't a coordination on financial regulation in the Eurozone, and Charlie was over there ensuring that there wouldn't be one. There are hard lessons to be learned. The government is back in the market as a main player, and by God, for those of you who favour state intervention, this government is making a total mess of it. They feel like being anti-statist. Bailouts are far from complete. Some of the banks should have been let fail, you all agree with this now, except the government wouldn't. Many good businesses are failing, and that's really quite sad. The regulators have woken up, and the governments, that's one thing internationally, they're now cooperating. Deflation is failing. National income has fallen by 20%, as I said. Prices are down. Core wages are sort of holding, depends on how you look at them. Unemployment is 13.5% officially, as I said. If you include those who want to work and can't get jobs, it's higher. There's big immigration, fiscal crisis, and so on. Lenihan said the senior bondholders will not share any of the burden with Irish taxpayers. Bloomberg Telia, just an amazing interview where he sounds like a bank spokesman rather than a finance minister of a formerly sovereign country. Okay, these are the, I just listed this. This is what deflation looks like. They're keeping to the 4-year period of recovery. Sadly, the opposition parties have bought into it for respectability. I think they're going to really regret that. There's talk of front-loading the adjustment, which is mainly cuts. Even the IMF that says this is very dangerous, and particularly if you apply it to Ireland. And the author of that paper spoke in Ireland last week, and in the Department of Finance, and we had a discussion with him. I've read it several times, and I found myself thinking, I'm closer to the IMF guy than I am to these guys in the Department of Finance. I'm not saying roll on the IMF. That kind of talk is dangerous. They're going to cut investment further. They're going to increase taxes on all earners. They're saying we must reduce the get in. There's half of people not paying taxes. Truth is, half of all the tax units are part-time workers, people who worked, for 2 weeks in the year and so on. So the figures are distorting. And they're not going to burn the Anglo or nationwide building society bondholders, and there's no reform of corporate governance. Okay, the correct solutions. I don't want to be totally pessimistic. I have a different view. Give up on the 4-year plan, be realistic, but still it's important to show everyone we're going to do hard things to get back, but not in 4 years. It won't be met, and they all kind of know that, but they're stuck with it. Do not front-load the adjustment. Make it judicious cuts, and I support. It's unusual for a trade unionist to say they support cuts, but things are so bad I think we have no choice. And actually, there are plenty of areas for reform without killing off services or employees in the public services. Every public servant I know can point to others. They're usually over that way, not here. Don't cut investments further, but increase it. Tax the broadest shoulders. For instance, why not extend the 2% income levy that you and I are all paying in addition to our income tax to the corporate sector? It'll raise 630 million, and up the seed capital gains and inheritance taxes and various other taxes on sort of passive income. It won't take money out of the economy. Reform corporate governance and burn the Anglo and nationwide building bondholders by 90%. The figures are actually wrong. I've been looking at them again, and you save at maximum, if you got 90%, I think you'll save 30 billion. And you'll see today they're actually burning the subordinated bondholders, and they're going for 20%. So this, what I'm talking about, is serious stuff. But it's risky, I'll admit that. Negotiate with the bondholders, as I said, share the burden, save billions, and I think most bondholders know there's a difference between sovereign and private debt. That debt was run up by those guys in Anglo-Irish, Anne Fingleton and Michael Walsh in Nationwide. And it wasn't run up by the state, but Lenihan and his officials foolishly went and gave a blanket guarantee to those banks and to everyone. That guarantee runs out in December. Renew it, as they've said, for depositors up to 100,000, and start burning the bondholders then, including the seniors. The lenders may balk and say, well, we're not going to lend to Ireland because it's now sovereign. You have nationalised the private debt. I say, yeah, it's risky, but we've 20 billion in cash borrowings already, and we've 24.1 billion in the pension fund, so I think we could survive till the end of next year. But listen, if we do burn we could avoid the markets, but if we do burn the bondholders and reduce these huge debts that were privately run up by 20 billion, then we're 20 billion better off as a nation. Bondholders have short memories. And they'll be in saying, here, this country has just got rid of 20 billion in debts. Other bondholders will say they're actually a more attractive outfit to lend to. But no one's discussing this. Jim Stewart will discuss it either later today or tomorrow whenever he's speaking. There's a solidarity bond. We suggested it. It's quite pathetic compared to what we suggested. The interest rate's too low, and it should be earmarked, hypothecated to particular projects. There should be auto-enrolment in pensions, 1st of January. There's a load of money in PRSIs. If we only got a proportion of that and had it into the state, the generation of those would generate huge sums of money to help us out of the hole. There's been 9 continuous quarters of decline in GNP, and I think that deflation has really failed. What we have is a choice of different strategies and different ways of doing each thing. And it's a question of degree, really, on each of them. And even in the room, we probably disagree substantially. I think that front-loading, you've heard this, we must take the punishment now. This is when the economy is at its most delicate, when we don't know about the banking problems yet in full. But I think front-loading today is akin to saturation bombing, and it'll be a wasteland, and there'll be no green shoots for years to come. The economy is a dynamic organism, and it can't be hacked to death to make it grow. And as Stiglitz said, specifically talking about Ireland, yeah, you need to cut. There's a gap of whatever it is, it keeps changing. Say it's 5 billion and you cut 4, or it's 20, so you cut 7. It'll look as if you're getting closer, but actually by cutting that much, you're killing off growth, and things are getting worse. Unfortunately, the other view, the deflationary view, is the dominant one. I think that the cuts course have lost. The policies have patently failed to date. But the guys who believe this are in office, in government, in finance, in the universities. But there's a huge debate on this stimulus versus austerity abroad. And they're even talking about us and saying, we're bonkers. The Financial Times is saying we're quite wrong. The answer, as I keep saying, is someplace in between, but it's probably further away from austerity. I suppose I'd say that as a left person. So in conclusion, we have 3 crises. Jobs, massive unemployment, big fiscal problem, huge banking problem. We must radically amend. Now, the government is only focusing on the fiscal and banking. You hear nothing about jobs. The 3 of them are intrinsically linked. You can't separate them, because if we get the jobs, we'll deal with the fiscal. And if you burn the bankers, you'll deal with the fiscal and the jobs too. We need less cuts and more tax raising, but very careful tax raising, and I disagree with people in this room on how far you could go. My own left-wing instinct is tax them to death, but that can be very counterproductive as well. And some of the tax suggestions would affect even moderate people on moderate incomes. An investment program in infrastructure and education and skills, in Congress we're going to suggest we take 2 billion, instead of cutting $1 billion, and they might cut more, we take 2 billion from the famous pension fund. We are going to spend quite a bit of it. Actually take it from there and spend it over 3 years. I think in year 1 it would be quite hard to find shovel-ready projects, but if you do it 6 billion over 3 years, it will give a lot of confidence into the economy, as well as multipliers. A new public-private paradigm. I've been saying this for some years and I'm wasting my time, because the truth is the private sector, the corporate banking sector, virtually destroyed this country, aided by some in the public sector, particularly the bank regulator, within the whole edifice of this ideology of markets actually work without intervention. But of course, the scapegoat has been the public sector, and both sectors they interact together. I know of one firm that gets all of its income, and it's a big professional firm, all of its income from public sector gigs that it does, and I think does very well. So it's private sector, of course, but the two are interlinked, and you know, a new government, when it comes in next year or sooner, must address this and rebalance our attitude to both. New governance system, social solidarity. If they do this savagery that some are talking of, I think it'll reach the tipping point and we might have a real problem in Ireland. So we must build on the strengths where I started. There's a good real economy there, incredibly high-skilled people. More than half of us, the younger people, are going to universities, third levels. And we deal with the banking crisis. So, in conclusion, deflationary cuts will delay the recovery. It might even be worse. And there are alternatives, and that's what we're here to discuss this weekend. Thank you.
One thing that, if I may add to all the very important things that you said, one thing that really surprises me is that a lot of these governments, like the Irish and the British, have in some ways nationalized the banks, and yet they don't actually run them. We have the banks that receive masses of money, as you say, and then they don't lend, for example, to SMEs. And one question I would pose to you, and indeed to policymakers, why don't you use them? If you're on the board of these banks, why don't you not beg them to lend to SMEs, tell them to lend to SMEs? I mean, the Chinese do it, the Brazilians do it, the Indians do it. Why can't you do it? And we used to do it in the past, in the 50s and 60s. You know, you had mandatory minimums, roofs of what you could do. And we've forgotten that. We just think in terms of bailing out, but then they don't do what they're supposed to do. And we just beg them to do this. But actually, the government and the people are in charge of these banks. So that's power that I think is not yielded. So it gives me now great pleasure to ask Larry Michel, who many of you know. He's president of the EPI, which is an important think tank. In fact, it's the leading progressive think tank in the United States. And it's closely linked also to the unions. So he will tell us the American story, which has more elements of optimism, I think.
Listen, I really appreciate being here and partnering with TASC and FEPS. It's really important to have a network of social democratic think tanks. It's only really emerged in the last 10 years or so. And it's very important for us to share experiences and thinking. So I really appreciate having these partners. So my discussion today is going to be limited to what's happened in the U.S. and an evaluation of the sort of budgetary fiscal policy. What we did, how did it fare, and my evaluation of the results, both politically and economically. So what happened to the economy? In December 2007, we entered into a recession after actually having had 6 months of rising unemployment before then. In early 2008, under a Republican president, we actually had our first stimulus plan of around 1% of GDP, all dedicated to tax cuts. In the fall of 2008, with the financial crisis, the economy started to plummet. The irony of all this is that helped elect a Democratic president, and you'll see that the deep crisis is also going to undo some gains of the Democrats in the Congress in an election in 2 weeks. So the President Obama took office in January, legislated a stimulus plan in February, which started to take effect in April of 2009. So let me explain what the situation is before the stimulus plan actually took effect. The unemployment rate was already 8.6%, double what its low point was of 4.3% in the spring of 2007. In the prior 6 months, the GDP had been falling at a 6% annualized rate. we had already lost 4% of our job base, which is more jobs that had been lost since the Great Depression. Had never, even in the deep recession of the 1980s, we never had that severe a job loss. So in came the stimulus plan. I'm going to leave out of the story the housing market and the banks. Just focus on the budget. There actually was a bank bailout. The American people seem to forget that it was actually implemented by the Republican president, although they blame Obama for it. There's actually, I'll just tell you, I saw a really funny shirt at a rally 2 weeks ago. It was a picture of George W. Bush, and it said, "Boy, I really messed up, and thanks for blaming the black guy." I think that summarizes pretty much American politics. Anyway, I can actually sit down. That's really the story. The stimulus plan, the fiscal plan, was legislated in February, took effect in April. It had 4 parts. And I'm going to explain them because one of my critiques of the American Democrats and the left is they never learned how to explain why this actually is supposed to help in terms of jobs. So one part was safety net spending, mostly unemployment insurance, that allowed people to get benefits for up to 2 years when usually you can only get it for 6 months. And also increase something called food stamps for the poor. And why that helps? Well, if you give money to people who are going to spend it, and people who just lost their job and are trying to maintain just a fraction of their standard of living, spend the money, they don't pay off debt, and they're not busy investing. They're out spending it. Okay, so that was part one. Part two was they provided relief money to the state governments. And that's a big deal in the United States because a large part of our public sector is actually state and local governments. When the state and local governments have a deficit, they are by law in 59 of the 50 states obligated to have a balanced budget every year. So what that means is that they must cut programs and raise taxes. And in a Keynesian sense, when you do that, you're withdrawing demand out of the economy. When the federal government provides money to them so they don't have to do that, takes a deficit at the federal level, that prevents them from exacerbating the recession, but also helps support services. A third part was various types of investments in infrastructure and green jobs, energy alternatives, and a fourth part was tax cuts. 40% of the stimulus plan was actually tax cuts to individuals and businesses. Although to hear the Republicans who only favor tax cuts criticize it, you would never know. And in the way that our, no, I was going to criticize the administration, I'll get around to that later. You know, what was the result? The result is actually remarkable and positive. I give the stimulus plan an A-. When it left the administration, it got worse as it went through the Congress, but they did a pretty good effort, in my view. So the plan started in April. That's the beginning of the second quarter. The GDP barely fell at all in the second quarter after plummeting in the 2 quarters before that. By the summer, in June 2009, the economy actually started to expand. That's when we date the recovery. Job losses were 750,000 a month in the first 3 months of 2009. If you look at the chart, the job losses continued, but really moderated throughout the rest of 2009. And by January 2010, there was positive job growth. The problem is, of course, that the economy never grew fast enough that we got unemployment to stop rising. And so unemployment went from 8.6 before the stimulus and hit as high as 10.1% in the fall of 2009 and still remains at 9.6%. The various estimates would say that the jobs created or saved by the stimulus package were around 3.5 million, or roughly 3% of employment, and saved us around 2 percentage points of unemployment. So that's a very positive impact. Now the political result was that it was seen as unpopular and a failure. So it's a real question about how do you get that result? So I'm going to go through a list of how I think about it. One is that people never see the counterfactual. They never see the economy that would have been had you not done your policy. So you could be a lot better off than you would have been otherwise, but if you're still not in a good place, people observe, make judgments about what they see happening in their lives and the lives of their family, not in what economists say we could have had a deep depression and now we only have a really bad recession. That's not something you can run for office on. The second part is that Keynesian stimulus, the way it was done, the people who actually benefited from it, very few of them actually know they benefited from it. It's not like in the 1930s when there was government jobs given out, that people could say, President Roosevelt gave my daddy a job. No one can say President Obama gave their daddy or mommy a job, because all these things, as I explained, are helpful, but they're all very indirect. Third, we were really thrown into a really huge downturn. And it's really a time bomb left by George W. Bush. And so, in my view, the stimulus was too small for the scale of the problem we had. And many on the left, that's the narrative, that the stimulus was too small. I actually believe it was too small for the scale of the problem, but it's also not so clear that the government could actually have done more. Not a political argument, just what are all the mechanisms you can actually have to pump money into the economy and to do it in a way that you are confident that you won't have scandal, that it won't be inefficient. And the fact is that we've had 30 years of depleted government capacity. We did not have the capacity quickly to do a direct government job creation program. The last time we did that was in the late 1970s. There was no government agency that even knew how to do this. So you're thrown into a really, really deep problem, and even a really good effort is not enough that most people are going to feel that prosperity is there. A fourth problem is that the left and the Democrats, or what my friend Bob Kuttner says, are ideologically incompetent. That is, talking about the economy and what to believe in. When they talked about the stimulus, most of the Democrats would just talk about, it was like spending that you would like. You know, we did this kind of spending, we did that spending, but could never actually translate it from, we do this spending, so therefore this is how it creates jobs. We are helping the unemployed, not only because we care about the unemployed, but because it also creates jobs in the following way. They did not know how to do that at all. A fifth thing is that the administration almost immediately started taking credit for the economy. In May and June of 2009, they've only been in office for 4 months. They inherited the worst economy, in 70 years. And they started talking about what they called green shoots. That's like the little pieces of grass in the spring, as if you could sort of see, the flowers coming. And what they did is they basically took George W. Bush off the hook. They didn't blame the Republicans for it because they had a stance of trying to be bipartisan and trying to negotiate with the Republicans, and so not to make them angry. They didn't blame them. And as a result, people blamed them. That's pretty stupid. That's not only ideologically incompetent, that's politically incompetent. A sixth factor is that the state governments, which went into, had all these big deficits, they did end up having to cut a lot. So with stimulus at the federal level and anti-stimulus at the state level, I don't think it totally neutralized it, but it definitely weakened the total effect on the economy. Another factor was that in academic economics, Keynesianism had become a minority, limited, marginalized movement, dominated by the Chicago School, and that has an effect. There's also been, for 30 years, an attack on government, of which, the idea of government, some of which was abetted by the Democrats themselves. And that undercuts your ability to pursue an activist policy. And another factor, more about why we didn't get to do more, but some about the actual shape of the policy, was that the United States doesn't have a political system where a majority can pass legislation. In our Senate, you needed, because the Republicans decided to be obstructionists, they had the capacity to make you have to have 60 votes out of 100 to pass anything. And there was only, at different points, 59 or 60 Democrats. So that means you had to have absolutely every Democrat. And no Republicans would cooperate at all. So you had to have absolutely every Democrat. And, you know, it's pretty hard to get 100% compliance for something. And it also means the most moderate conservative members dictate the policy. So with Republican obstructionism and this kind of political institution, it makes for a really lousy policy. What does the future hold? Well, we've had unemployment near 10% for around a year and a half already, and it's going to be that way for another year and a half. So that's really the worst unemployment situation we've had. We calculate that there's an underemployment of around 16–17%. What this means is that over the course of a year, 1 out of 3 workers is going to be unemployed or underemployed, and for the minority population, it's around 40–45%. And that's where we've been for more than a year, and it's where we'll be for another year. No one is suggesting that we've been stalemated for future action. My view is that my critique of the administration is less about the shape of the first stimulus, but more that they didn't come last winter and come back for doing more for jobs. And it could be that just politically you only get one bite at the apple. But economically, politically, and morally, they should have done much more to make sure that the economy was growing, especially because there's a big election in November. You had to do something last November, December to make sure things were humming along better in this November, but they failed to do that. Part of it was because they thought that asking to do more was an admission that the first stimulus failed. I don't think that's really true. Secondly, they were all tied up with a health care reform, which was a good thing, but the way they bungled it, they took 6–9 months of activity, which not only took up all the time of the Congress, but all of the allied progressive groups were busy mobilizing for votes on health care and did not even put any pressure, didn't have the capacity to put any pressure for jobs. And there was also what they referred to as spending fatigue. And this is because the way the press and the conservatives described everything in all the policies in terms of how many hundreds of billions of dollars of spending. So you had a bank bailout of $700 billion, which most of the money actually doesn't cause a deficit because you're actually getting it back. Then you have a stimulus plan of roughly $700–800 billion, which is deficits, which are all described as a big spending plan. And then the healthcare plan, which was $1 trillion, which was actually deficit reducing because there were more taxes and spending cuts to pay for it. So three different things, but for the public view, everything was described as like $1 trillion this, $1 trillion that, and so it really freaked people out. Then there's the problem of what you're experiencing here and around Europe, even worse, the deficit mongering. And this is, you have the Republicans claiming, these are people that blew through large deficits. The hypocrisy is unbelievable. Inherited a huge surplus in 2000, did giant tax cuts, 2 wars, implemented a new social insurance program for prescription drugs, none of which was paid for. And then when it comes to Obama, they claim that he's running through up a deficit, which is almost all completely due to the fact that there's a huge recession, not because of any spending. But so they're saying that, they're crying about the debt and the deficits and claiming that Obama caused it. Then you have the conservative Democrats who are always busy posturing to make sure they're not considered liberal or progressive. And so they are always fiscal conservatives at any point in the business cycle. And then you have the administration who basically enabled all that. And no one was out there saying what is absolutely true. We had a huge record deficit because we had a huge record recession. When people aren't working, they're not paying taxes. When businesses aren't selling, they're not paying taxes on their profits. And spending goes up temporarily for unemployment insurance and health care and things like that in a recession. The way you get the deficit under control, as was said, is you first create jobs. These are complementary. These are not antagonistic. I'll just close from what my institute recommended as a plan last fall, which would have been a better way to go, but just as Stephanie said, it's good to put something positive out there. So we had the American Jobs Plan, $450 billion of spending, which is around 3% of GDP, which we would have wanted to have done over a year, year and a quarter. It would have been more safety net spending, continue the unemployment insurance program, which is very much not the experience in the last years. It's been very hard to renew that, and it comes up again in November. The Republicans say you can provide people unemployment insurance, but you have to pay for it. They don't have to pay for war spending, which is 3 times that much, but they have to pay for the unemployment insurance. Okay, so 1 was more safety net spending. 2 was a public investment agenda, roads, bridges, energy alternatives, to keep on going. 3rd was much more aid to the states. 4th was we recommended, got some criticism from some of our friends on the left, something called the temporary jobs tax credit, which would subsidize jobs for a small period of time, a year or 2, which we thought at the beginning of a recovery could help jumpstart job creation. And we said that you could pay for this, not necessarily within the first 2 years, but you could legislate a financial transaction tax starting in 3 years hence and go moving forward, so that over a 10-year period, it actually was deficit reducing, not deficit enhancing. So that was the road not taken. And so what we're facing is protracted unemployment and severe political losses in November. The Democrats will be lucky if they maintain both houses of the Congress, the Senate and the House. They're likely to lose the House, and they will not have power in 30 of the 50 states, governorships. We'll see what happens after that. Thank you.